Three sons abandoned their elderly parents on a deserted road under the scorching sun. "You're a burden we can't carry anymore," they said, before speeding away in their luxury car. But these heartless sons had no idea they were throwing away millions of dollars. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly on the empty highway as Margaret and William stood hand in hand, watching the black Mercedes disappear into the distance. The dust settled around their feet like a final goodbye, and the silence that followed was deafening. After 50 years of marriage and a lifetime of unconditional love for their sons, this was how it ended, abandoned on a deserted road like unwanted furniture. Margaret's weathered hands trembled as she clutched the small suitcase containing everything they owned. Her heart, which had beaten with love for her three sons for decades, now felt like it was cracking into 1,000 pieces. William, despite his failing health, squeezed her hand tighter, trying to be strong for the woman who had been his anchor through life's storms. "How did we get here, my love?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept across the barren landscape. Her eyes, once bright with the joy of motherhood, were now clouded with disbelief and pain. The morning had started like any other in the cramped house where they had been living with their eldest son, Robert. But there had been tension in the air, the kind that makes your stomach twist with anxiety. The whispered conversations in the hallway, the cold shoulders at breakfast, the way their sons looked at them as if they were strangers who had overstayed their welcome. Robert had been the first to approach them, his business suit crisp and his voice clinical. "Mom, Dad, we need to talk." Those 5 words had carried the weight of a death sentence. Behind him stood Sandra, her designer handbag clutched tightly, avoiding eye contact. Brian lounged in the doorway, scrolling through his phone as if the conversation was merely an inconvenience. "We've found a place for you," Robert had continued, his tone suggesting this was a business transaction rather than a family discussion. "A nice facility where you'll have proper care, people your own age to talk to." Margaret had felt the blood drain from her face. "You want to put us in a home? It's not putting you anywhere, Mom. It's finding you the best care possible. You'll be happier there." But the truth was written all over their faces. This wasn't about happiness or care. This was about convenience, about removing the burden of aging parents from their busy, successful lives, about no longer having to worry about medical bills, sleepless nights, or the simple inconvenience of sharing their space with the people who had given them life. William had tried to reason with them. "Son, this house was built with our own hands. Every brick, every board carries our memories. Dad, you're being emotional. This is the practical solution. Emotional. As if love, sacrifice, and family bonds were weaknesses to be overcome rather than treasures to be cherished." The facility had been exactly what Margaret feared, a sterile place where hope went to die. The smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the underlying odor of abandonment. Elderly residents sat in wheelchairs, staring at walls, waiting for visitors who never came. The staff was overworked and understaffed, treating the residents more like numbers than human beings with rich histories and broken hearts. For weeks, Margaret and William had clung to each other in that place, their only comfort being their shared love. They watched other residents fade away, not from illness, but from the crushing weight of being forgotten by those they had loved most. They saw the empty chairs in the visiting room, heard the phones that never rang, witnessed the tears that fell silently onto untouched meals. "We can't die here," William had whispered one night, his voice weak but determined. "If we're going to leave this world, let it be on our terms, breathing free air." The escape had been easier than expected. The night staff was minimal, security was lax, and desperation had given them strength they didn't know they still possessed. They had walked through the darkness, 2 figures supporting each other, carrying nothing but their dignity and their unbreakable bond. Now, standing on this empty road under the blazing sun, Margaret realized that her son's cruelty had revealed something profound. They had spent their entire lives believing that family was about blood, about obligation, about the ties that bind. But blood meant nothing when the heart was cold. Obligation was meaningless when love was absent. William's breathing was becoming labored, his face pale despite the heat. Margaret knew his heart was struggling, knew that the stress and heartbreak were taking their toll on his already fragile health. But she also knew that he would rather face whatever came next with dignity than spend another day in that soul-crushing facility. "Margaret," he said softly, "do you regret leaving?" She looked into his eyes, those same eyes that had looked at her with love on their wedding day, that had filled with tears of joy when each of their children was born, that had supported her through every challenge life had thrown their way. "Never," she replied firmly. "I'd rather face the unknown with you than live in comfort without hope." A truck appeared in the distance, its engine rumbling like thunder across the plains. Margaret raised her hand, not knowing if the driver would stop, not knowing what lay ahead, but knowing that anything was better than the living death they had escaped. The truck began to slow down, and Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there were still good people in the world, people who understood that every life had value, that love was more than a word, that family was more than shared DNA. As the truck came to a complete stop, Margaret squeezed William's hand one more time. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, as they had faced everything for 50 years. They were no longer the discarded parents of ungrateful sons. They were survivors, fighters, two souls who had chosen love over bitterness, hope over despair. The driver's door opened, and a young man stepped out, concern etched across his face. In that moment, Margaret realized that their real journey was just beginning. The young man who stepped out of the battered pickup truck had kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. His name was Daniel, and something about the sight of two elderly people stranded on a desolate highway struck him like a physical blow to the chest. He had been driving home from his construction job when he spotted them, two fragile figures standing against the vast emptiness of the road. "Good heavens, what are you folks doing out here?" Daniel asked, rushing toward them with genuine concern etched across his weathered face. The sun was merciless, and he could see that the elderly man was struggling to breathe in the oppressive heat. Margaret looked up at this stranger with eyes that held a mixture of hope and wariness. After what her sons had done, trusting anyone felt like stepping off a cliff. But there was something in this young man's face that reminded her of the kindness she had almost forgotten existed in the world. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion and emotion. "My husband has a weak heart. He needs help." Daniel didn't hesitate for even a second. Without asking questions or demanding explanations, he gently helped William into the air-conditioned cab of his truck. Margaret climbed in beside her husband, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. As they drove toward the nearest town, Daniel glanced in his rearview mirror at the couple. William's breathing was shallow, his face pale despite the heat. Margaret held his hand with the devotion of someone who had spent a lifetime loving the same person through every storm life could throw at them. "I'm Daniel," he said softly, trying to keep the conversation light. "And you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. Right now, let's just focus on getting your husband the care he needs." The kindness in his voice nearly broke Margaret's composure. When was the last time someone had spoken to them with such gentle respect? When had anyone cared about their well-being without calculating the cost or inconvenience? At Mercy General Hospital, Daniel refused to leave. While doctors examined William, Daniel sat with Margaret in the waiting room, bringing her coffee and speaking words of comfort. He called his wife Sarah to let her know he would be late, explaining the situation with the passion of someone who genuinely cared about strangers in need. "You don't even know us," Margaret said through tears. "Why are you helping us?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped together as he searched for the right words. "My grandparents raised me after my parents died in an accident. They showed me what real love looked like, what family should be. When I saw you two on that road, I saw them." Hours later, when the doctors confirmed that William had suffered a minor heart episode brought on by stress and dehydration, Daniel was still there. He had made calls to find them temporary accommodation, researched local support services, and even contacted a social worker he knew from his volunteer work at the community center. But it was what happened next that would change everything. Sarah arrived at the hospital just as the doctors were preparing William's discharge papers. She was a nurse at the pediatric ward across town, and her shift had ended hours ago. Yet here she was, carrying a bag of clothes and toiletries for two strangers, her face glowing with the same compassion that had drawn Daniel to stop on that lonely highway. "Daniel told me what happened," Sarah said, embracing Margaret as if she were a long-lost relative. "We have a guest room at home. You're not spending another night without a proper roof over your heads. Margaret broke down completely. The kindness was overwhelming after so much cruelty. These young people, complete strangers, were offering more love and care than her own sons had shown in years. That evening, in Daniel and Sarah's modest but warm home, the four of them sat around a dinner table laden with simple, delicious food. William's color had returned, and for the first time in months, Margaret saw him smile genuinely. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and the easy comfort of people who understood that family wasn't always about blood relations. "We've been married for 8 years, Sarah explained as she served homemade apple pie. "We always dreamed of having a big family, with grandparents and cousins and Sunday dinners where everyone argued about politics and laughed until their stomachs hurt. Instead, we got each other," Daniel added, reaching for his wife's hand, "which has been more than enough. But meeting you two, it feels like the universe is giving us the family we always wished for." William cleared his throat, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "You don't know anything about us. Our own sons couldn't stand having us around. We're just two old people with more problems than solutions." "With respect, sir," Daniel said firmly, "your sons are fools. Any parent who raised sons capable of abandoning them on a highway clearly gave more love than they received in return. That says nothing about you and everything about them." Later that night, as Margaret lay in a comfortable bed for the first time since leaving the nursing facility, she listened to William's steady breathing beside her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Daniel and Sarah talking quietly in their room, making plans to help their unexpected house guests find permanent housing, discussing doctor appointments and social services with the dedication of loving children. "William," she whispered into the darkness. "Yes, my dear? Do you think we're dreaming? Do you think people this kind really exist?" William was quiet for a long moment. "I think we spent so many years being hurt that we forgot what genuine love looks like. But it's real, Margaret. These young people, they're showing us what our sons should have been." In the kitchen, Sarah was researching elder care options on her laptop, while Daniel made notes about medical appointments and insurance issues. They attacked the problems facing Margaret and William with the intensity of people fighting for their own family members. "They've been through so much," Sarah said, her voice heavy with emotion. "How could anyone abandon their own parents like that?" "I don't know," Daniel replied, pulling his wife close. "But they're safe now, and they're not alone anymore." Neither Daniel nor Sarah knew about the envelope that had been forwarded to William's old address weeks ago. Neither knew about the inheritance that would change everything. They were helping because it was the right thing to do, because love demanded action, because sometimes the universe puts broken people in your path so you can help put them back together. But tomorrow would bring revelations that none of them could imagine. The morning sun streamed through the cheerful curtains of Daniel and Sarah's guest room when Margaret awoke to the sound of gentle knocking. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the sterile walls of the nursing facility or feel the hard mattress that had tortured her back for weeks. Instead, she found herself in a comfortable bed, William breathing peacefully beside her, and the smell of fresh coffee wafting from the kitchen. "Margaret? William?" Sarah's voice was soft and respectful. "There's someone here to see you." "A gentleman from Patterson and Associates law firm." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Law firms meant trouble, meant bills they couldn't pay, meant more complications in lives already shattered by betrayal. She gently shook William awake, watching as confusion gave way to the same worry that was knotting her stomach. They dressed quickly and made their way to the living room, where a distinguished man in his 60s sat holding a thick manila envelope. His kind eyes and patient demeanor immediately put them somewhat at ease, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that their brief respite of peace was about to be disrupted. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrison," the lawyer stood and extended his hand. "I'm Thomas Patterson. I've been trying to locate you for quite some time. This concerns an inheritance from your late uncle, Sebastian Harrison." William's face went blank. "Uncle Sebastian? But he passed away years ago. We attended his funeral." "Yes, sir. However, his estate has been in probate due to some complex international investments. We've been sending correspondence to your last known address for months, but it appears the letters were never forwarded to you." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Their last known address was Robert's house, where they had lived before being forced into the nursing facility. Every piece of mail that came for them had been handled by their eldest son, who claimed he was managing their affairs while they adjusted to their new living situation. "What kind of inheritance?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out several official documents. "Your uncle Sebastian was quite successful in his later years. He invested heavily in technology companies and real estate. The total estate value is approximately $23 million, plus several commercial properties." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah dropped the coffee mug she was carrying, the ceramic shattering on the hardwood floor. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth agape. But it was Margaret who found her voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. $23 million? Yes, ma'am. Your uncle specified in his will that everything should go to his nephew William, as you were the only family member who ever visited him in his final years or showed him genuine affection. William's eyes filled with tears as memories flooded back. Uncle Sebastian had been the black sheep of the family, the eccentric old man who never married and spent his time tinkering with inventions. Most relatives had written him off as odd, but William had always made time for him, bringing Margaret and the children for Sunday visits, listening to his stories, treating him with the dignity everyone else denied him. "The irony," Margaret said softly, "is profound." Thomas looked puzzled. "Ma'am? Our children abandoned us because they saw us as a financial burden. They never knew we were inheriting a fortune that could have solved every problem they claimed we created." Daniel and Sarah exchanged glances, beginning to understand the full scope of the betrayal Margaret and William had endured. Not only had their children been cruel, but they had been spectacularly foolish as well. "There's more," Thomas continued, consulting his notes. "The correspondence we sent included instructions for accessing immediate funds for any medical or living expenses. Your uncle specifically set aside a substantial amount for your care, anticipating you might need assistance as you aged." William laughed bitterly. "So while we were being told we were too expensive to keep around, there was money sitting in an account specifically designated for our care." "Where were these letters sent?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "To the address we had on file. 1247 Maple Street, care of Robert Harrison." The betrayal cut even deeper now. Robert had not only forced them into the nursing facility while claiming poverty, but he had been intercepting letters that contained information about resources that could have kept them comfortable and independent. Every complaint about medical bills, every argument about grocery costs, every moment they were made to feel like burdens had been built on lies. Sarah was the first to break the heavy silence. "This means Robert knew. He knew about the inheritance and let you suffer anyway." "It means all three of our children knew," William said, his voice growing stronger with anger. "Robert, Sandra, and Brian. They made a conscious decision to hide this from us while treating us like unwanted baggage." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the family drama unfolding before him. "I should mention that we also sent a final notice last month, informing the household that if we couldn't locate you within 30 days, we would be forced to begin the process of declaring you deceased and distributing the inheritance to your next of kin." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Next of kin would be our children. Exactly. That 30-day period expires in 2 days. The room spun around Margaret as the full picture became clear. Their children hadn't just abandoned them out of convenience or cruelty. They had been playing a calculated game, waiting for them to die or disappear so they could claim an inheritance worth $23 million. The nursing facility wasn't just a way to get rid of inconvenient parents. It was a holding pattern until nature took its course. "They were waiting for us to die," she whispered. Daniel stepped forward, his jaw clenched with righteous anger. "That's why they never visited. That's why they never called. They needed you to stay hidden until you were declared dead." "But we're very much alive," William said, and for the first time since the lawyer arrived, Margaret heard strength returning to his voice. "And now we know exactly what our children's love was worth." Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. "Given the circumstances, I'd recommend we expedite the inheritance transfer. You'll need to come to my office to sign some documents and provide identification, but I can have funds available within hours." Sarah sat down heavily on the couch. $23 million. "You'll be able to live anywhere you want, hire the best medical care, travel the world. Money doesn't heal a broken heart," Margaret said softly. "It doesn't bring back the children we thought we had raised, but it does provide options we never imagined." William reached for her hand. "What do you want to do, my dear?" Margaret looked around the modest living room, where two strangers had shown them more kindness in days than their own children had shown in years. She thought about Daniel's calloused hands and honest work, about Sarah's gentle nursing of a man who wasn't even related to her, about the way they had opened their home without hesitation or calculation. "I want to build something beautiful," she said finally. "Something that honors the love Uncle Sebastian showed us and the love these wonderful people have shown us. Something that proves family isn't about blood or money, but about choosing to care for each other." Thomas smiled. "That sounds like exactly what your uncle would have wanted. He always said the money should go to people who understood the difference between price and value." As they prepared to leave for the lawyer's office, Margaret caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The broken, defeated woman who had stood on that highway seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone who had been tested by betrayal and found strength she didn't know she possessed. The inheritance would change their lives, but the real transformation had already begun the moment Daniel's truck stopped on that lonely road. They had learned that love was a choice, that family was something you built rather than something you were born into, and that sometimes the universe's greatest gifts came wrapped in the most painful packages. Their children had gambled everything on greed and lost. Now it was time to show them what real wealth looked like. The transformation was remarkable. Within a week of signing the inheritance papers, Margaret and William had moved into a beautiful colonial home in the prestigious Riverside district. The house wasn't ostentatious, but it radiated warmth and dignity, exactly what they had dreamed of during those dark nights in the nursing facility. Daniel and Sarah had helped them choose every detail, refusing any payment, but accepting the title of family with tears in their eyes. Margaret stood in her new kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner for 6 people. The extra guests were elderly friends from the nursing facility, whom they had quietly helped escape to better living situations. The inheritance wasn't just changing their lives. It was becoming a beacon of hope for forgotten souls across the city. She was arranging fresh flowers when Sarah burst through the front door, her face pale with urgency. "Margaret! William!" Sarah called out breathlessly. "You need to see this. There's a car parked across the street, a black sedan. The same 3 people have been sitting there for over an hour, just watching the house." William emerged from his study, where he'd been reading investment reports with the enthusiasm of a man discovering hidden treasures. The inheritance had awakened a sharp business mind that decades of being dismissed had kept dormant. 3 people? He asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Margaret's stomach dropped as she peered through the living room curtains. Even from a distance, she recognized the silhouettes. Robert's rigid posture as he gripped the steering wheel. Sandra's perfectly styled hair catching the afternoon sun. Brian slouched in the back seat, probably scrolling through his phone. "They found us," she whispered. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his protective instincts immediately activated. "How could they have found you so quickly?" "Money leaves a trail," William said grimly. "Large financial transactions get noticed. They probably hired an investigator the moment they realized we'd vanished from their neat little plan." The black sedan's doors opened simultaneously, and Margaret watched her 3 children step onto the sidewalk with the confidence of people who believed they held all the cards. They had dressed for success, Robert in his expensive suit, Sandra in designer attire that cost more than most people earned in a month, Brian in casual clothes that somehow still screamed privilege. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, instinctively moving closer to Margaret as if to shield her from what was coming. "We face them," Margaret said, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "But this time, we do it on our terms." The doorbell rang with an imperious chime that seemed to demand immediate attention. Margaret walked to the door with measured steps, William beside her, Daniel and Sarah flanking them like loyal guardians. When she opened the door, she was struck by how much her children looked like strangers to her now. "Mother," Robert began, his voice carrying that same condescending tone that had once made her feel small. "We've been worried sick about you." "Worried sick," Margaret repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. Interesting choice of words. Sandra stepped forward, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, Dad, when we heard you'd left Sunset Manor, we were terrified something had happened to you." "Something did happen to us," William said quietly. "We discovered the truth." Brian, who had been examining the expensive fixtures visible through the doorway, finally looked up from his phone. Nice place. Must cost a fortune to rent something like this. We're not renting, Margaret said simply. The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken knowledge. Robert's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications. Sandra's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. Brian actually looked up from his device, genuine surprise replacing his usual boredom. How? Robert asked, abandoning all pretense of concern. Uncle Sebastian's inheritance, William said, watching as his children's faces went through a spectrum of emotions. Shock, calculation, and finally, barely contained rage. That's impossible, Sandra snapped. We would have known about any inheritance. You did know, Margaret said, her voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. The law firm has been sending letters to your house for months. You intercepted every single one. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Robert's face flushed red, but whether from shame or anger, Margaret couldn't tell. Sandra's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Brian, for once in his life, seemed completely speechless. We can explain that, Robert began, but William held up his hand. Explain how you planned to let us die in that facility while you waited to inherit $23 million. The number hit them like a physical blow. Brian's phone clattered to the porch as his hands went limp. Sandra gripped the doorframe for support. Robert's face went from red to white in seconds. $23 million, Sandra whispered. Plus commercial properties worth several million more, Margaret added, watching as greed overtook any remaining pretense of family affection in their eyes. Look, Robert said, his voice taking on the desperate edge of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. There were misunderstandings. We were trying to protect you from stress while we figured out the best way to handle everything. Protect us? William laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You protected us right into a living nightmare while you counted money that wasn't even yours. Daniel stepped forward, his presence adding weight to the confrontation. I think you should leave now. And who exactly are you? Brian asked, finding his voice at last, though it came out as more of a snarl. I'm their family, Daniel said simply. The family they chose when their blood relatives threw them away. Sandra's composure finally cracked completely. Family? These people aren't your family. We're your family, your children. We have rights. Rights? Margaret's voice rose for the first time, decades of suppressed pain pouring out. You have the right to love and be loved, which you threw away. You have the right to forgiveness, which you've never asked for. You have the right to try to make amends, which you've shown no interest in. But you have no right to our money, our home, or our lives. Mom, please. Robert tried again, but his voice lacked conviction. We can work this out. We're still family. Family doesn't abandon their parents on empty highways, Sarah interjected, her nursing instincts making her protective of vulnerable people. Family doesn't lie about finances while complaining about costs, William added. Family doesn't intercept legal documents and hide life-changing information, Margaret finished. The three children stood on the porch, their carefully planned reunion crumbling around them. The inheritance they'd been so sure would fall into their laps was now permanently beyond their reach, held by parents they'd written off as irrelevant. This isn't over, Brian said, his voice carrying a threat that made Daniel step closer to the door. Yes, it is, Margaret said with finality. You made your choice when you left us on that road. We've made ours by building a real family with people who understand what love actually means. She began to close the door, but Robert jammed his foot in the gap. Wait, we'll contest this. We'll prove you're not competent to handle this much money. You'll do nothing, William interrupted, except learn to live with the consequences of your choices. Margaret gently but firmly moved Robert's foot and closed the door. Through the window they watched as their former children stood on the porch in stunned silence before slowly walking back to their car, their dreams of easy wealth disappearing like morning mist. Are you okay? Sarah asked softly. Margaret looked around at the people who had become her true family, then at the home that represented not just financial security, but emotional freedom. I'm better than okay, she said. I'm finally free. The weeks that followed brought a peace Margaret had never imagined possible. The sprawling colonial house had transformed into something extraordinary, a sanctuary where love grew like wildflowers after rain. What started as a home for two had evolved into a haven for 8 elderly souls, each one rescued from the cold indifference of institutions and ungrateful families. Margaret walked through the sun-drenched conservatory, watching as Harold taught chess to Eleanor, while Dorothy tended to the herb garden that had become her pride and joy. These weren't charity cases or burdens. They were chosen family, each bringing their own wisdom, humor, and resilience to their shared home. "Mrs. Harrison," called Janet, the house manager they'd hired to coordinate care and activities. "There's a situation developing outside." Through the front windows, Margaret saw them, a growing crowd of reporters and camera crews setting up on the sidewalk. News vans lined the street like mechanical vultures, their satellite dishes pointing skyward as if summoning judgment from above. "How did they find out?" William asked, joining her at the window. "Money this large doesn't stay secret long," Daniel said, arriving with Sarah for their daily visit, especially when it involves a story this compelling. The doorbell rang with its familiar chime, but this time it carried a different weight. Margaret opened it to find a polished reporter with perfectly styled hair and teeth that seemed to gleam with practiced sincerity. "Mrs. Harrison, I'm Jessica Chen from Channel 7 News. We're running a story about your incredible inheritance and the inspiring work you're doing for the elderly community. Would you be willing to share your story?" Margaret hesitated. Publicity felt dangerous, like opening a door she might not be able to close. But then she thought about all the forgotten souls still trapped in loveless facilities, all the families torn apart by greed disguised as practicality. "Yes," she said. "I think it's time people heard the truth." The interview took place in the garden, surrounded by the laughter of people who had found family in their golden years. Margaret spoke with quiet dignity about abandonment and betrayal, about the difference between blood relations and chosen family, about how love multiplied when shared freely. "And your biological children?" Jessica asked gently. "Have they attempted to reconcile?" Margaret's expression remained serene, but her words carried the weight of absolute finality. "They made their choice when they prioritized money over love. We've made ours by building something beautiful from the ashes of that betrayal." The story aired that evening, spreading across social media like wildfire. Within hours, Narshosh Cho's family was trending nationally. The segment showed the contrast starkly. The cold calculation of children who abandoned their parents for financial gain versus the warm community that had bloomed from genuine care. But the real earthquake came the next morning. Margaret was serving breakfast when Sarah rushed in, her tablet clutched in her hands and her face a mixture of shock and vindication. "You need to see this," Sarah said breathlessly. "It's about Robert's company." The headline made Margaret's blood run cold. "Harrison Enterprises under federal investigation for embezzlement and tax fraud." The article detailed how Robert's seemingly successful business had been built on a foundation of lies. Client funds misappropriated, taxes evaded, investors defrauded. The investigation had been ongoing for months, but the publicity from Margaret's story had prompted several victims to come forward with additional evidence. "There's more," Sarah continued, scrolling to another article. "Sandra's been fired from her executive position for falsifying expense reports and misusing company credit cards." William read over Margaret's shoulder, his expression growing more somber with each revelation. "And Brian? Arrested for selling stolen goods. Apparently his entrepreneurial ventures involved fencing merchandise from construction sites." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of cosmic justice. Margaret thought about the children she had raised, the values she had tried to instill, the countless bedtime stories about honesty and kindness that had apparently fallen on deaf ears. "How did we not see this?" William asked quietly. "We saw what we wanted to see," Margaret replied. "We saw the potential for good in people we loved, even when they were determined to prove us wrong." Over the following days, the consequences continued to unfold, like dominoes, falling in perfect sequence. Robert's legal troubles multiplied as investigators uncovered years of financial misconduct. His expensive lifestyle crumbled as assets were frozen and creditors circled. The Mercedes that had carried him away from his parents' abandonment was repossessed in front of local news cameras. Sandra's fall was equally dramatic. Her designer wardrobe and luxury apartment became distant memories as legal bills consumed her savings. The networking circles that had once welcomed her now whispered behind her back about the woman who had abandoned her elderly parents while stealing from her employer. Brian's descent was perhaps the most pathetic. Without family support or legitimate income, he found himself facing not just criminal charges, but the harsh reality of consequences he had spent his adult life avoiding. Meanwhile, the Harrison house continued to thrive. Margaret and William's story had inspired donations from across the country, allowing them to expand their mission. They purchased adjacent properties, creating a campus where elderly people could live with dignity, purpose, and genuine care. Ironic, isn't it? Margaret mused one evening as she and William sat on their porch, watching their chosen family enjoy dinner in the garden. They threw us away to avoid the cost of caring for us, and now they've lost everything while we've gained more than we ever dreamed possible. William squeezed her hand. Uncle Sebastian would have loved this. He always said the best revenge was living well. A month later, Margaret received 3 letters delivered on the same day. Each bore the desperate handwriting of a child who had finally understood the true cost of their choices. Robert's letter spoke of financial ruin and legal troubles, begging for forgiveness and financial assistance. Sandra's was a catalogue of professional disasters and personal isolation, pleading for a second chance. Brian's was the most pitiable, written from jail, asking for bail money and promising to change. Margaret read each letter twice, feeling not satisfaction but a profound sadness for the people her children had chosen to become. When William asked what she planned to do, her answer came without hesitation. Nothing, she said simply. They made their beds with remarkable consistency. Now they can lie in them. That evening, she threw all 3 letters into the fireplace, watching as the paper curled and burned. The flames consumed not just the words, but the last remnants of obligation she felt toward people who had forfeited the right to call themselves her children. As the ashes settled, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Complete peace. The cycle was finally broken. The inheritance that was meant to be a blessing had revealed the true character of everyone involved. Those who deserved love had found it abundantly, while those who chose greed had discovered its ultimate cost. Outside, laughter drifted through the windows as Dorothy told one of her famous stories to a captivated audience. Harold was teaching young neighborhood children to play chess in the evening light. Eleanor was planning tomorrow's activities with the enthusiasm of someone who had rediscovered purpose. This was what family looked like. This was what love could build when freed from the constraints of obligation and expectation. Margaret smiled as she watched William help Janet set up for tomorrow's art therapy session, his heart condition forgotten in the joy of meaningful work. The abandoned parents had become the center of a chosen family that proved love was not about blood or inheritance. It was about the daily choice to care for one another, to build rather than tear down, to create beauty from the ashes of betrayal. Justice had arrived not as punishment, but as perfect balance. Those who gave love received it multiplied, while those who chose selfishness discovered the true poverty of their choices. 2 years had passed since the inheritance changed everything, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a single home for abandoned elderly had evolved into the Harrison Foundation, a network of care facilities that was revolutionizing how society treated its aging population. Margaret stood before the mirror in her office at the Foundation's headquarters, adjusting the simple but elegant dress she'd chosen for today's ceremony. At 74, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect, her eyes bright with purpose that had been missing for so many years. The woman who had once been discarded like yesterday's newspaper was now featured on magazine covers as Philanthropist of the Year. "Mrs. Harrison," came a gentle voice from the doorway. It was Rebecca, the Foundation's Director of Operations, a brilliant woman in her 40s who had lost her own parents to neglect in substandard facilities. Margaret had personally recruited her, recognizing a kindred spirit who understood that caring for the elderly was about preserving dignity, not just extending life. "The delegation from Senator Williams' office has arrived," Rebecca continued. "They're here to discuss the proposed Elder Care Reform Act that would be based on your foundation's model." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with influence. The foundation's success had caught national attention, leading to invitations to testify before Congress about transforming elder care across the country. What had started as personal healing was becoming a movement that could affect millions of lives. As she walked through the headquarters, Margaret marveled at how far they'd come. The building buzzed with activity as social workers, medical professionals, and advocates worked tirelessly to expand their reach. Through the windows, she could see the original Harrison house, where William was leading his daily gardening workshop with residents who had found new purpose in nurturing life. The conference room was filled with politicians, journalists, and advocacy groups, all eager to understand how the Harrison Foundation had achieved what government programs and private institutions had failed to accomplish for decades. Margaret took her seat at the head of the table, flanked by Daniel and Sarah, who had become the Foundation's directors of family services. "Mrs. Harrison," Senator Williams began, "your foundation has demonstrated remarkable results. Decreased mortality rates, improved mental health outcomes, and significantly lower costs per resident compared to traditional facilities. What's your secret?" Margaret smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought her here. "There's no secret, Senator. We simply remember that elderly people are human beings with stories, wisdom, and hearts that still need love. When you treat people as valuable family members, rather than burdens to be managed, everything changes." Dr. Patricia Martinez, the Foundation's chief medical officer, presented the data that had captured national attention. Mental health improvements of over 70% among residents. Medication needs reduced by half. Most remarkably, a waiting list of families begging to move their elderly relatives into Harrison facilities, the complete opposite of the industry norm. "The key, Dr. Martinez explained, is our integrated family model. We don't separate generations. We bring them together. Young families volunteer their time, children visit regularly for educational programs, and our residents become surrogate grandparents to those who need them." A journalist raised her hand. "Mrs. Harrison, we understand your own children have had significant legal troubles since your story became public. Have they attempted to reconcile?" The room fell silent, everyone aware of the spectacular downfall of the Harrison children. Robert's embezzlement conviction had resulted in a 5-year prison sentence. Sandra's corporate fraud had led to bankruptcy and permanent blacklisting from the financial industry. Brian's theft charges had been followed by a series of increasingly desperate criminal activities. "My former children made their choices," Margaret said with calm finality. "They chose money over love, convenience over commitment, selfishness over sacrifice. The consequences they're experiencing are the natural result of those choices, not punishment from us." William entered the room at that moment, still vital despite his heart condition, his face glowing with the satisfaction of meaningful work. He took the seat beside Margaret, their hands finding each other automatically after 52 years of marriage. "The beautiful irony," William added, "is that by abandoning us to pursue wealth, they lost access to wealth beyond their imagination. Not just the inheritance, but the richness that comes from building something meaningful, from being part of a real family." Daniel stood to present the expansion plans. "We're opening 12 new facilities this year, each designed around the Harrison model. We're also launching the Chosen Family Initiative, which matches elderly individuals with younger families who want to adopt grandparents." Sarah displayed photographs of success stories that brought tears to many eyes. Elderly Holocaust survivors teaching history to high school students. Former engineers mentoring young inventors. Retired teachers helping struggling students discover their potential. Each image showed the magic that happened when society stopped seeing age as decay and started recognizing it as accumulated wisdom. "The waiting list for our Chosen Family program now exceeds 5,000 applications," Sarah reported. Young couples, single parents, and childless adults are all eager to gain elderly family members. "We're proving that love multiplies when it's shared freely." After the meeting, Margaret and William walked through Harrison House, visiting with residents who had become true family. In the sunroom, 90-year-old Frederick was teaching chess to 8-year-old twins, whose working mother brought them for after-school care. The kitchen buzzed with activity, as former restaurant owner Giuseppe taught cooking classes to teenagers from the local culinary school. "Remember when we thought our lives were over?" William asked, as they sat in the garden where their journey of rebuilding had begun. "We were right," Margaret replied. "Our old lives were over. But sometimes death is necessary for rebirth." The evening news featured their story again, but this time the focus was on systemic change rather than personal triumph. The Harrison model was being studied by universities, copied by other philanthropists, and seriously considered by government agencies looking to reform elder care. As they prepared for bed that night, Margaret found a letter that had been delivered earlier. The return address made her pause. It was from the state penitentiary where Robert was serving his sentence. "Another letter from one of them?" William asked, noticing her expression. Margaret opened it, scanning the contents quickly. Robert's handwriting was shakier now, his words desperate. He spoke of finding religion in prison, of understanding his mistakes, of wanting to make amends. He detailed his fellow inmates' respect for what his parents had accomplished, how the Foundation's work was even reaching into correctional facilities through their volunteer programs. "He says he's changed," Margaret said quietly, "that he understands now what real wealth means." William waited patiently for her decision, knowing this moment had been inevitable. "Maybe he has changed," Margaret continued. "Prison can teach harsh lessons, but change doesn't erase consequences, and understanding doesn't automatically restore relationships." She placed the letter in the drawer with the others, similar missives from Sandra and Brian that had arrived over the months. Each contained apologies, explanations, and pleas for forgiveness. Each remained unanswered. "Do you think we're being too harsh?" she asked William. "I think we're being realistic," he replied. "True repentance isn't about wanting forgiveness when you're facing consequences. It's about changing behavior before you're caught. They had years to choose love over money, years to treat us with dignity. They chose differently every single time." Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words. The Foundation's success had taught her that love required boundaries, that forgiveness didn't mean removing consequences, and that sometimes the most loving thing was to let people experience the full weight of their choices. Outside their window, the sound of laughter drifted from the evening activity room where 3 generations were gathered for game night. Daniel and Sarah's adopted daughter, little Emma, named for the grandmother she would never meet, was teaching card tricks to residents who marveled at her small hands and bright smile. This was what family looked like when built on choice rather than obligation, on love rather than genetics, on daily decisions to care for each other rather than legal requirements. The Harrison Foundation wasn't just changing elder care, it was redefining family itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to expand their mission, new chances to prove that love was the most powerful force for change in the world. But tonight, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of a life rebuilt from ashes, of purpose found in the depths of betrayal, of justice served not through revenge but through the simple act of choosing to build rather than destroy. The abandoned parents had become architects of a better world, proving that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the cruelest packages. 5 years had transformed everything. Margaret stood at the podium of the National Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 3,000 delegates from around the world who had come to learn about the Harrison model. Behind her, a massive screen displayed statistics that would have seemed impossible just years ago. Elder abuse down 60% in regions implementing their programs, family satisfaction rates at 97%, and waiting lists stretching into the hundreds of thousands. But numbers, Margaret knew, never told the whole story. "When my husband and I were abandoned on that highway," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast auditorium, "we thought our story was ending. We had no way of knowing it was actually beginning. In the front row sat the living proof of that beginning. Daniel and Sarah, now the Foundation's co-directors, held their twin toddlers, biological children who would grow up surrounded by the wisdom of chosen grandparents. Beside them, Dr. Martinez smiled proudly as she prepared to present the medical breakthroughs that had emerged from treating elderly patients with dignity rather than resignation. Rebecca, who had become like a daughter to Margaret, coordinated the international expansion that now spanned 12 countries. Each facility bore the same core principle. Family was not about blood or obligation, but about the daily choice to love and be loved. The Harrison Foundation now operates in 47 cities, Margaret continued. But our real success isn't measured in buildings or budgets. It's measured in the number of people who have discovered that love multiplies when it's shared freely. She paused, her eyes finding William in the audience. At 77, he had defied every medical prediction. his heart growing stronger with purpose rather than weaker with age. Beside him sat their chosen family, 3 generations bound not by genetics but by genuine affection. "Today I want to share 3 letters that arrived this week," Margaret said, producing envelopes from her jacket. "They represent the completion of a journey that began in abandonment and has led to transformation beyond our wildest dreams." The first letter was from Jessica Martinez, a young mother whose own parents had abandoned her elderly grandmother. Through the Harrison Foundation's intervention program, 3 generations had been reunited and were now thriving together. She writes, "Mrs. Harrison, your story saved my family. When I saw what happened to you, I realized I was about to make the same mistake my parents made. Instead of putting Grandma Rosa in a facility, we joined your chosen family program. Now my children have the grandmother they deserve, and I have the mother figure I never knew I needed." The second letter came from Dr. James Mueller, director of the World Health Organization's Aging Initiative. He writes, "The Harrison model has become the gold standard for elder care globally. Your approach of treating aging as accumulated wisdom rather than inevitable decline has revolutionized how nations approach their demographic challenges. You've proven that the problem was never too many elderly people. It was too little love." Margaret paused before opening the third letter, knowing this moment would complete the circle that had begun with such pain. "This final letter," she said quietly, "comes from someone many of you know about. Someone whose choices helped create the very crisis that led to our mission." The auditorium fell silent as Margaret unfolded pages covered in Robert's familiar handwriting. "My eldest son writes from prison. Mom, I've spent 5 years watching the Foundation's work reach even into this place. Elderly inmates abandoned by their families now have visitors through your programs. Former drug dealers are learning life skills from retired teachers. The guards tell me about their parents finding dignity in Harrison facilities. I see the ripples of what you built spreading everywhere, healing wounds I didn't even know I had caused. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I understand that trust once broken must be rebuilt through actions, not words. I'm writing to say thank you for showing the world what real strength looks like. When we threw you away, you didn't become bitter. You became better. The Foundation helps thousands of families avoid making the mistakes we made. In a strange way, our cruelty became the seed of something beautiful. I hope someday to earn the right to be proud of you again, instead of just grateful that you survived us." Margaret refolded the letter carefully. "I share this, not because reconciliation is always possible or even advisable, but because it illustrates something profound about the nature of justice. True justice isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. It's about turning pain into purpose, betrayal into breakthrough, abandonment into abundance." She gestured toward the screen, which now displayed photographs of families reunited, elderly people finding new purpose, young families gaining wisdom from adopted grandparents. The children who abandoned us thought they were getting rid of a burden. They had no idea they were actually creating a movement that would redefine how the world treats its most vulnerable members. They chose money over love and lost both. We chose love over bitterness and gained more than we ever imagined possible. William joined her on stage, moving with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to measure his remaining time in moments of meaning rather than years of existence. "My wife and I have made our final decision about those letters," he announced. "We will not be responding to them, not out of cruelty, but out of wisdom. Real change happens through action, not apology. If our children truly understand what they've lost, they'll spend their remaining years building bridges with others instead of trying to rebuild the one they burned with us." Margaret nodded, then addressed the audience with the passion that had driven their mission from the beginning. "To the families watching this broadcast around the world, remember this. Every elderly person in your life is a library of wisdom, a repository of love, a connection to history that will disappear forever when they're gone. Don't wait until it's too late to value what you have. Don't mistake the cost of care for the value of a person. Don't let pride or convenience rob you of relationships that money cannot replace." The standing ovation began slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo that lasted several minutes. But Margaret barely heard it. Her attention was focused on a young woman in the back of the auditorium, tears streaming down her face as she talked urgently on her phone. Margaret recognized the look. It was the same expression she'd worn when she finally understood what really mattered. Another family was about to be saved. Later that evening, at the Foundation's anniversary celebration, Margaret and William found themselves surrounded by their chosen family. Daniel and Sarah's children played with dozens of other youngsters whose lives had been enriched by the wisdom of adopted grandparents. Former residents of their facilities, now thriving in intergenerational homes, shared stories and laughter with the advocates who had fought for their dignity. "Any regrets?" William asked as they watched the celebration unfold around them. Margaret considered the question seriously. 5 years ago, she might have regretted the pain, the abandonment, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed them. Tonight, she could honestly say she was grateful for every moment of that journey. "None," she said firmly. "If we hadn't been broken, we never would have learned how strong we really were. If we hadn't been abandoned, we never would have discovered what real family looks like. If we hadn't lost everything, we never would have found our true purpose." As the evening wound down, Margaret found herself alone for a moment in the garden where her transformation had truly begun. She thought about Uncle Sebastian, whose unexpected inheritance had made their mission possible. She thought about the highway where they had stood abandoned, not knowing it was actually the first step toward freedom. She thought about the nursing facility that had seemed like a prison, but had actually been preparation for understanding the needs of the forgotten. Every piece of their story, even the most painful parts, had been necessary to create something beautiful. The final guests were leaving when a young couple approached her hesitantly. The woman was pregnant, the man nervous but determined. "Mrs. Harrison," the woman said softly, "we don't have any living grandparents for our baby. We were wondering, could we apply for your chosen family program?" Margaret smiled, seeing in their faces the same hope that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her journey. "Of course," she said, reaching out to embrace them both. "That's exactly what we're here for." As she watched them walk away, already planning the interviews and matching process that would connect them with elderly people longing for family, Margaret felt the deep satisfaction of a circle finally completed. The abandoned had become the architects of belonging. The discarded had become the foundation for dignity. The forgotten had become the memory keepers for future generations. And in the end, love had won.